From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
New testing data shows the loss of learning from COVID-19 school shutdowns as readers write in on student loans, ranked choice voting, and trust in government. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Alicia Finley. Welcome to you both. So, Monet, we've gotten some new testing data from the NAEP. And can you just take us through what those scores are and what do we think that they mean?
So for background, the NAEP is a recurring assessment of student performance kind of based on a standardized test, which is administered to public school students. And so it evaluates performance in reading and math, kind of core disciplines. And it's a way of tracking how well students are learning at grade school level over time. And so we got the results for the past couple of years just recently. And what they show compared with the pre-pandemic performance is that there's been a really dramatic decline in student performance. We saw, I believe, a 5-point decline in reading scores and a 7-point decline in math scores over the past couple of years. And it just is showing the ways that having schools closed, a lot of kids at home trying to learn via Zoom, sort of contributed to an inability of teachers to actually transmit knowledge to these kids, and probably a lack of discipline, general disorganization, stalled progress for a lot of these kids. And I think it's become clear to people that this is going to lead to a lasting setback for a lot of the students who were affected by pandemic school closures. It's going to be very difficult in coming years to try to make up some of that gap in the learning time that was lost during the pandemic.
And Alicia, can you help put some of those numbers in more context? What does it mean, a drop of 5 points or 7 points? How long would that kind of a erosion of learning take to make up if students are now back in schools and teachers are working extra hard to try to get them caught up?
Basically, the last 2 years during the pandemic have erased all the gains going back to the late 1990s. The growth in the last decade has really stagnated. You haven't actually seen any gains going back to 2008, and experts aren't quite sure why that is. And part of it's probably the stagnating scores at the bottom level. Those who are already lower achievers and minorities really aren't making gains, while those who are upper income and higher performers have. So you've actually seen an achievement gap widening over the last decade, and actually widened even more over the last 2 years. So just to take an example, in I believe it was reading, where you saw 10 points, the lowest decile, 10% of performers lost 10 points on this exam, which was compared to only 2 points among the top 10%. Now, the likely reason, of course, for this is that the high performer students probably come from wealthier households, and their parents probably had time and sat with them and tutored them after their daily Zoom sessions, and probably made sure that, tended to their education, while the lower income households and those who tend to be lower performers didn't have that personal education and homeschooling per se. But I think it'll take, obviously, a lot more time for those same reasons to catch up for those lower income students and those lower performers than the higher income and higher performers, who will likely bounce back from this than maybe a few months. We see this, and we continually hear about, summer learning loss, and kids after, they leave school in June, and they actually have found that, they lose several months of education just within the summer hiatus. They do make up some of that when they return in the fall. But again, there's a matter of catch up, which is probably why a lot of schools nowadays assign summer education, summer reading, to ensure that students don't lose everything or a lot of what they learned in the previous year. Now, there's going to have to be a lot of remedial education going on for the next, several years. It could take up to decades. I don't think it'll take up to decades for those lower income students to catch up. But I don't think also what you're hearing is that, we just need to throw more money at these schools, these lower income, and then that'll help more without actually saying how they plan to use the money. But I think it's going to take a lot more than money. I think you're actually going to need some kind of education reforms that we've actually seen have made a difference in places like Washington, D.C., charter schools expansions, merit pay to encourage more teachers, high quality teachers, to go into the profession. Florida as well. Those are the states where you've actually seen gains within the last decade, or those who have embraced education reforms. And I think that's going to be the way that ultimately these students are going to be able to catch up.
But the divergence of students under Zoom learning is something that at least fits my intuitions, that the kids who have the resources and someone tutoring them after school are going to be just fine, and the kids who don't are the ones who won't be. And there's also some survey data in here that suggests that's what happened. The figures here are for 9-year-old students, and the lower performing students were less likely, they said, to have a computer available to them all the time, to have access to high-speed internet, to have a quiet place to work, to have a teacher available almost every day to help them, or to have someone else help them once or twice a week. Less likely, they say, to recognize when they aren't understanding something, less likely to feel like they can ask for help, less likely to know where to find other resources to help them. And so, Minay, I mean, that's part of the problem of, I think, what we saw during the Zoom learning is it was the kids who were not really understanding it who were really being left behind.
Right. I mean, I'm glad to hear that people have conducted studies to confirm what some of the contributing factors are to how students have performed differently under school closures and Zoom learning. But I also think that it's something that should be intuitive to most people if you just think about it. Maybe you're a parent with a couple of kids, or maybe like me, you just can remember what it was like to be a student. It's clear that sort of kids differ in their ability to focus, and that there are some kids who, if you put them in the classroom, introduce a few subjects to them, they're very clearly going to take to them and become sort of self-starting and be able to stay focused and retain the things that they're learning. And other kids kind of struggle with that, and they really benefit from being in that classroom setting every day with a teacher standing at the front of the room, making sure that they're paying attention. Maybe they have to work a little bit extra hard to focus, but in the right conditions, they are able to absorb the lessons. But once you get rid of that sort of equalizing component of having all the students together in the classroom, then the kids are going to just revert to their nature, basically. And it's going to become that much harder for the kids who are already facing disadvantages, whether it's their own ability to focus or some of the distractions they might have in the home. They're going to fall even further behind. That's one thing that we have now learned to not take for granted about schools, just the way that they are able to balance some of these differences in terms of what students face in their pursuit of learning.
As we're getting in this kind of data about learning loss, though, I mean, Alicia, have you seen any of the cities that closed their schools or the teachers' unions that argued for that? Have you seen any of them saying, oops, sorry, that was a mistake and we will learn a lesson from this? Or are they sort of just carrying on and still defending the policies to close the schools?
Kathy Hochul, New York governor, the other week did actually admit some remorse for closing schools and other disruptions to schools, including their testing and quarantine requirements, which continued after vaccines were widely available and schools were open. So kids who were exposed to the virus or maybe had tested positive for one day were required to stay out of school for 10 days, which was very excessive and disruptive to education. Or there were states like Florida and Texas, generally more Republican-leaning states, where that didn't happen. And what we've actually seen in some studies is those states, or in those states that kept schools open and had fewer disruptions, had less remote learning. Students actually had less learning loss. We're going to find out some of that on state-specific scores from the NAEP coming out within a month or two. But there have been state-level assessments that have been done, and researchers have kind of aggregated that and found that those who were in states that kept schools closed longer and did more virtual education, those students lost more at learning over time. I think that's, again, while the NAEP scores that will come out, state level specific scores that will come out in the next couple of months, later this fall, will be particularly interesting and particularly illuminating. You read Randy Weingarten's tweet. I think it wasn't even a comment. She just tweeted something in response to a New York Times story on the learning loss. Quote, "Thankfully, after 2 years of disruption from a pandemic that killed more than 1 million Americans. Schools are already working on helping kids recover and thrive. This is a year to accelerate learning by rebuilding relationships, focusing on the basic. Again, no remorse, no regret. And a lot of the other officials including Nancy Pelosi, who in June 2020 who said that the single most important public health measure to protect people was to keep schools closed. I mean, Beto O'Rourke will probably be eating his word and supporting the school closures too. He's running for governor in Texas, but none of these of them have really walked back their support for the most part. I think Kathy Hochul is really an exception. In part, politicians never want to admit that they're wrong. The problem has been, even as new evidence amassed during the pandemic, that's not only that students and kids were at very low risk for illness and severe illness, and they weren't really primary transmitters, but the school's closures actually not only led to more mental health problems, but they actually led, ironically, to more transmission within the homes, because school kids were more likely who weren't in schools were actually staying at home, and they were actually more likely to get sick. That was at least one finding from one study, which is probably explain some of the disparities between Florida, why Florida didn't have a huge amount of spread or much more spread than other states, despite keeping schools open. The home environment was where the virus has been spreading. It wasn't the schools. None of the scientific or quote unquote scientific recommendations were really based on any science. Neither was the CDC's, which reopening guidance, if you recall, last spring, that was basically written in part by Randy Weingarten and the teachers unions. The whole point of this, the school shutdowns, was to extort more money from taxpayers. And in part, I think there were a lot of teachers. Some teachers really didn't want to go back to work or back to classes. It was far easier for them to just teach via Zoom instead of getting dressed, getting prepared, and actually going back into the classroom. Sad to say, because I think there were a lot of teachers who actually very much wanted to get back, and they were frustrated. And I can say this anecdotally, having my nieces and nephews and their teachers, and they did want to go back to the classrooms, but basically the district and the union wouldn't let them.
Well, Florida is one place that I will be fascinated to watch this debate play out. And one reason is that the Democratic nominee for governor now, Charlie Crist, who is challenging Governor Ron DeSantis, he has chosen as his running mate Carla Hernandez Matz, who is the president of Miami's United Teachers of Dade. And reading here now from an op-ed in the Journal's pages, it says, in September 2020, the UTD organized a caravan, including a hearse, to protest reopening schools outside the Miami-Dade County School Board headquarters. Ms. Hernandez-Matz insisted that, quote, lives are going to be lost, unquote, if Miami schools reopened. And so, Monet, I mean, I fully expect that will be something that Governor DeSantis and his running mate raise, especially pointing to this new testing data now.
Yeah, I would bet you that the DeSantis campaign staff is already putting together materials to advertise the credentials of Charlie Crist's running mate. And I frankly think that Crist's decision to put her on the ticket is really revealing of his strategy, and also the fact that he probably thinks he faces an uphill climb to beat DeSantis in the election. And I say this because education has become a winning issue for Republicans over the course of the past couple of years. Traditionally, parents who prioritized education tended to lean Democrat if it was one of their top issues. But as a result of the school closures and also a lot of controversy over curricula, you have seen Republicans start to gain ground. And that has been particularly true for Ron DeSantis. He went out and campaigned on behalf of Republicans aligned with getting some of the more controversial progressive elements out of school curricula. And he also made sure to keep Florida schools open as much as possible during the pandemic. And it seemed like that gave him a really big boost in support. So Crist probably is conceding that the middle of Florida voters has become somewhat out of reach, and he really just wants to energize the left and energize the teachers union, frankly, to turn out, and is hoping by sort of signaling that he's going to be willing to kind of cater to their interests, make sure that school funding stays robust, make sure that there's less scrutiny on the school curricula in Florida schools, that he's going to be their protector, and he hopes that he's able to gin up enough support from that small but concentrated base to offset the ways by which sort of the center has drifted towards Republicans on the issue of education.